That house is an eyesore. It should be illegal. That's what Karen, our HOA president, screamed when she saw what I'd done. But here's the thing, it wasn't illegal. I made sure of that. Let me take you back to how this all started and how my house became national news by turning our quiet suburban neighborhood into a full-blown war zone. It began with a lime green envelope on my door. Inside was a violation notice claiming my perfectly fine white house needed immediate repainting due to fading and discoloration, with a $250 fine that would double every 30 days. I stared at my house in disbelief. The paint was barely 5 years old. This wasn't about maintenance, this was personal. Karen had been targeting me ever since I questioned the mysterious increase in our annual dues at the January meeting. Her designer athleisure-wearing, clipboard-carrying inspections had become everyone's nightmare since she'd been elected HOA president. But what she didn't know was that I'm an art teacher with access to the most eye-searing color combinations known to mankind. And more importantly, I had just discovered a loophole in our HOA rules that would change everything. Karen thought she was teaching me a lesson, but she had no idea what was coming. The community center was packed for the HOA meeting. I came prepared with photos of my house and a highlighted copy of the CC&Rs I'd studied like religious text. When my turn came to speak, I approached the microphone with confidence. "I'd like to contest this violation," I began. "My house paint shows normal wear for its age, but is far from requiring a complete repaint." I displayed my carefully documented photos on my iPad. Karen didn't even glance at the evidence. Section 5.3a clearly states that all exterior paint must be maintained to community standards, she recited robotically. "Perhaps Mr. Anderson doesn't understand what those standards are." That fake smile never reached her eyes. "The violation stands," she declared. "The board has approved a new color palette for our community. Mr. Anderson will need to select from the approved swatches when repainting." She pushed a thin binder across the table. Inside, the most boring collection of beiges, taupes, and off-whites imaginable, 50 shades of bland with pretentious names like Sophisticated Sand and Timeless Taupe. "I'll need time to review these," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Time isn't something you have in abundance," Karen replied. "The deadline for compliance is 45 days. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of the thousands I'd have to spend on an unnecessary paint job. As a high school art teacher with my daughter's college applications coming up, my budget was already stretched thin. As I scrolled through county building codes looking for some loophole, I stumbled upon the historic record of our neighborhood's development plans. Our housing development, built in the late 1980s, had once been farmland. The original CC&Rs were actually quite limited compared to Karen's revised version. I started visiting the county records office after school, spending hours comparing original covenants with current rules. What I found made me sit up straight. The HOA had the right to approve exterior colors, but there was nothing about a restricted palette in the original legally binding documents. The official color palette was just a recommendation, not a requirement. A plan began forming in my mind. If I had to paint my house, I would follow the rules exactly as written, not as Karen chose to interpret them. The next Saturday, I invited Howard over for coffee. Howard had lived in the neighborhood since the first houses were built and had mentioned serving on the original HOA board. "These color restrictions Karen's enforcing, they're not actually in the binding covenants," I said, showing him my research. Howard adjusted his glasses, examining the papers. "That's right," he confirmed. "In the beginning, we only cared that colors weren't garish or offensive to maintain property values. We never specified exact shades. That's a recent invention." He leaned closer. "You know she's been targeting people who stand up to her, right? Last month, the Johnsons questioned the pool renovation budget. Suddenly they had violations for their bird bath and garden gnomes. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who was making everyone's lives miserable. I spent the next week researching paint colors, not the elegant neutrals in Karen's binder, but colors that would comply with the letter of the law while sending a clear message. The county had specific restrictions prohibiting certain fluorescent or reflective paints, but there was a wide range of vibrant colors that remained perfectly legal. I consulted with an artist friend who specialized in color theory. Together, we created a palette that would be impossible to ignore but wouldn't violate any actual laws. My daughter Emma thought I was having a midlife crisis when I shared my plan. But after hearing about Karen's targeting of other neighbors, she was fully on board. In fact, she offered to help design the pattern to maximize visual impact. Finding a painting crew willing to execute my vision was challenging. 3 companies turned me down, saying they didn't want to get involved in HOA disputes before I finally found Pablo's painting service. Pablo looked at my color choices, raised an eyebrow, then broke into a wide grin, pointing to his brightly colored company. "Van, this I understand. Sometimes you must make a statement," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. We scheduled the work for the following week when Karen would be out of town at her timeshare in Florida. The painting took 4 days. Each day, neighbors slowed their cars to watch the transformation, some giving thumbs up, others looking horrified. By day 3, a small crowd would gather in the evenings to watch the progress. Howard brought lawn chairs and beers. It became something of a neighborhood event. My house was becoming a masterpiece of malicious compliance. The base color, sunset magenta, a vibrant purplish pink that practically vibrated in direct sunlight. The trim, citrus explosion, a yellow, so bright it looked radioactive. The shutters, electric lagoon, a blue that could be seen from space. And the front door, radioactive lime green. Pablo had suggested using color-blocking techniques to enhance the effect, creating geometric patterns that drew the eye in clashing yet technically harmonious ways. When the work was complete, I stood across the street, admiring our creation. It was hideous in the most magnificent way possible, deliberately garish yet painted with perfect professional precision. No one could claim it was poorly maintained or applied. Technically, it complied with every maintenance standard in the HOA guidelines. Karen returned from her vacation on a Sunday. The screech of her luxury SUV's tires on the asphalt was audible from my living room. I peeked through the blinds to see her standing in the middle of the street, mouth open in shock, staring at my house for a full 3 minutes without moving. She finally snapped out of her trance, storming up to my door and pounding on it with both fists. I opened it calmly. "Good afternoon, Karen," I said with a pleasant smile, ignoring her apoplectic expression. "What have you done?" she screamed, her face nearly matching the magenta of my house. "I complied with the violation notice," I replied. "My house has been repainted to correct the fading and discoloration." This is unacceptable," she sputtered, spit flying from her mouth, her perfectly highlighted hair seeming to bristle with electricity. "Actually, I conducted thorough research," I said, pulling out my binder, much thicker than her color palette, "and found that while the HOA has approval rights for exterior colors, there is no legally binding restricted palette in our covenants." I showed her the original documents with the relevant sections highlighted. "These colors meet all county code requirements as confirmed by the building department," I continued, handing her the official letter I'd obtained specifically for this moment. "As for maintenance standards, the paint was professionally applied with 3 coats and will be highly resistant to fading for years to come." Her eyes bulged as she flipped through my documentation. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head, looking for a way to force me to repaint. "This isn't over," she hissed, snatching the violation notice from my hand and scribbling something on it. Expect formal notice of a special board meeting. Her handwriting was so angry it was barely legible. When she strode back to her SUV, phone already pressed to her ear, I closed my door and finally released the laughter I'd been holding back. The special board meeting was scheduled for the following evening. But word of my colorful rebellion had spread throughout the community by then. Emma had helped me create a simple website documenting the entire saga, including copies of all relevant documents, the county codes, the original covenant, Karen's violation notice, and photos of the painting process. I printed flyers with the website address, and my daughter distributed them throughout the neighborhood. The stage was set for the final showdown. That evening, the HOA meeting room was packed, standing room only as neighbors squeezed in to witness the showdown. Dozens of people who had never attended meetings before showed up, some wearing sunglasses as a joke, saying they needed protection from my house's brightness. Karen called the meeting to order, her voice tight with barely controlled rage as she launched into a presentation about property values and community standards. Several slides featured close-up photos of my house, with dramatic red circles highlighting particularly vibrant sections. Mr. Anderson's garish color choices are in direct violation of our community standards, she declared, her laser pointer shaking slightly as she jabbed at the screen. We'll be requiring immediate repainting and assessing additional fines for willful non-compliance. I raised my hand, and Karen had no choice but to acknowledge me, given the packed room. I approached the microphone calmly. I've reviewed all legally binding documents for our community, I began. The original covenants, which supersede any subsequently created guidelines, state only that exterior colors must be approved to ensure they're not offensive. I displayed the documentation on the overhead projector. I verified with 3 separate real estate attorneys that my color choices, while admittedly bright, do not meet the legal definition of offensive and comply with all county regulations. Howard spoke up from the audience, confirming my interpretation of the original rules. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Garcia, the quiet kindergarten teacher who lived on the corner, stood up. I received a violation last month for my daughter's chalk drawings on our own driveway, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. If bright colors violate community standards, why are some residents allowed to have them and others aren't? Her question opened the floodgates. Suddenly, everyone had a story. The Patels had been cited for their garden decorations, while Karen's friend Susan had a fountain 3 times the allowed size. Mr. Johnson, the retired firefighter, recounted how he'd been fined for his grandson's toys left in the yard, while board member Bob's boat had been parked on the street for months without consequence. Each story revealed a pattern of selective enforcement and favoritism that had gone unchallenged until now. Karen tried repeatedly to regain control of the meeting, banging her gavel and threatening to clear the room. But the tide had turned. For every rule she cited, I produced documentation showing either exceptions or misinterpretations. This meeting is about Mr. Anderson's violation, not a forum for general complaints, Karen insisted, her voice rising an octave. Actually, I interjected. This meeting is about selective enforcement of arbitrary rules. My house is just a symptom of a larger problem. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The climax came when I projected the HOA financial records I'd obtained through a Freedom of Information request. Why did we need a special assessment for pool maintenance, I asked, when the reserve fund had over $200,000? And why did the contract go to Superior Pool Services, owned by Karen's brother-in-law, at 3 times the cost of competing bids? The room erupted. Several people jumped to their feet demanding answers. Karen's face went from red to white as she realized this had gone far beyond a dispute about house colors. Board member Ellen Franklin, who had always voted with Karen, slowly removed her HOA pin. I was never shown these financial records, she said quietly. I think we need a full audit. With those words, the dam broke. 3 other board members expressed similar concerns. Karen attempted one final power play. "She's right," she said, pointing at Ellen. "We'll need a forensic audit of all finances, including the unauthorized website Mr. Anderson created using our HOA's name." That's when Emma stood up from the back. "I created the website momsrevenge.com actually," she said. "Not using your HOA name at all, just documenting a homeowner's experience with excessive regulations. The domain is registered to me personally, and everything posted is factually documented with evidence." She smiled sweetly. "I'm majoring in pre-law at community college. This has been an educational experience." A laugh rippled through the room. Even some board members couldn't hide their smiles. Karen's face flushed again. "This is ridiculous. The rules exist for a reason, to maintain our property values and community standards." "No one's arguing against reasonable standards," I responded. "We're arguing against arbitrary enforcement and lack of transparency." Mr. Patel, normally reserved, stood up. "I've lived in 5 different communities with HOAs. None has been as restrictive or as selectively enforced as this one has become in the past year." Heads nodded throughout the room. "I move for an immediate suspension of all current violations pending a complete review of governance procedures," Howard called out. "Second," voices echoed from multiple directions. "You can't do that," Karen sputtered. "That's not on the agenda." "Actually," I said, pointing to the bylaws I'd conveniently displayed on the screen, Section 8.3 allows for emergency motions from the floor when seconded by at least 5 members in good standing. Karen looked around the room, realizing she was losing control completely. With a visible effort, she straightened her spine. "Fine. All those in favor of suspending enforcement pending review?" Hands shot up across the room. "All opposed?" Only Karen and 2 board members raised their hands. "The motion carries 56-3, I announced, having counted quickly. Thunderous applause filled the room. Karen banged her gavel one final time. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, gathering her materials with shaking hands. As she stalked toward the exit, she paused beside me. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed. "Actually," I replied quietly, "I think I do. I've reminded everyone that an HOA should serve the community, not rule it." She pushed past me and out the door as neighbors surrounded me, sharing more stories of Karen's reign of terror and congratulating me on standing up to her. The next morning, a news van parked across from my house, a young reporter grinning as she prepared to go live. "Local man protests homeowner association with what might be the brightest house in the county," she began. "This story's really about fighting back against abuse of power," I explained on camera. "It's about communities standing up against selective enforcement and intimidation." Within 24 hours, my Technicolor house had gone viral locally, becoming a symbol of rebellion against HOA overreach. Karen submitted her resignation the following week, citing personal reasons. The interim board immediately launched a complete review of all HOA rules and financial records. Howard was asked to chair the committee, given his historical knowledge of the original covenants. 2 months later, a complete reorganization had occurred with new bylaws requiring transparency, financial disclosures, and limitations on the board's enforcement powers. As for my house, I kept it exactly as it was for exactly 1 year to the day, after which I repainted it, a cheerful but more moderate blue, not because anyone forced me, but because I'd made my point. Karen put her house on the market shortly after her resignation. I heard she moved to a neighborhood without an HOA. Apparently, even she couldn't stand living under the kind of arbitrary rules she'd so enjoyed enforcing on others. Last week, I received a letter from a homeowner in a nearby community asking for advice on challenging their own power-hungry board. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is following the rules exactly as written. even when that means painting your house the most eye-searing colors legally allowed.